The night she ran, the ground was frozen. Not the soft freeze of early autumn that yields under a boot and leaves prints behind. The hard freeze, the kind that had been building since the first week of November, working its way down from the surface into the clay beneath, until the whole earth had gone rigid and unforgiving and indifferent to whatever moved across it. Vesna moved across it anyway. She had been planning this for longer than she had admitted to herself. The planning had not looked like planning. It had looked like watching, like counting, like learning which floorboards gave sound and which ones did not, which hours of the night Gorm slept deepest, which direction the wind came from, and whether it would carry sound back toward the house she was leaving. She had filed these things away without naming what she was filing them for, because naming it made it real, and real things could be taken from you, and she had learned not to hold real things where anyone could see them. On the night of the third moon after the harvest, Gorm drank until his breathing changed. She had learned to read his breathing the way farmers read weather. The pattern she was waiting for was the one that meant 2 hours at minimum, maybe 3. She lay still for 40 minutes after the change. Then she moved. She took 3 things. Her boots, the small blade she had kept in the lining of her left sleeve for a year and a half without ever having to use it, and a piece of dried meat from the cold larder that she folded into the inside of her coat without stopping to think about whether it was enough. It was not enough. She took it anyway. The back door opened without sound. She had worked the hinges for 2 weeks with tallow she collected in a small piece of cloth. She had told herself she was doing it because the squeak bothered her. She had not told herself anything else. Outside, the cold hit her face like a hand. Not a cruel hand, just a hand. The kind that reminds you it is there. She did not run immediately. Running was the thing that drew eyes, even in the dark, even when there were no eyes to draw. Running was a shape that the night read as prey. She walked until the house was behind the tree line. Then she ran. The road from Gorm's land split at the old mill foundation, half a mile south. Left was the way she knew. Left was where the road went through 2 settlements she had passed through before, where people would recognize her, where Gorm had passed through enough times to leave the shape of himself in people's memories. Left was familiar, which meant left was where he would look first. She took the right fork, not because she knew where it went, because she did not. This was what 3 years of being someone's certainty taught you, that the known things were the dangerous things, that the map someone else had drawn for you was the map they would use to find you. The only safe direction was the one that was not on that map. She ran until her legs stopped being willing to run, and then she walked, and then she ran again when the cold made walking feel like standing still. She slept in a ditch the first night with her coat over her head and her knees against her chest, and she did not sleep so much as fall unconscious for a few hours and wake up with the disorientation of someone who has not yet remembered where they are or what they have done. Then she remembered. She lay in the ditch for exactly as long as she could afford to, which was the time it took to decide she was not going back. Then she got up and walked south. She came to Heron Falls on the second day because her legs had stopped being willing to carry her past it. The town was the size of a place that had never needed a name anyone outside it would recognize. One main road, a market square that still held the mud of the last rain in its low spots, a mill that ran visible from the south approach, 2 taverns, a healer's house set back from the lane. The kind of place where 400 people knew each other's business with the thoroughness of people who had nothing larger to compare it to. She did not go into the town. She circled the edge of it the way she had circled everything for 3 years, reading it from the outside before deciding what it was. She was looking for a place to stop that was not a place where she would have to explain herself. Not a door she would have to knock on, not a fire she would have to ask permission to sit near, not a barn where someone's son would see her leave in the morning and note the direction. She found the tannery at the end of a back lane. She found it because it was the end of something, not the beginning. Because the lane dead-ended there, which meant only the people who had reason to use the lane used it. Because the smell of the work was a smell that kept casual visitors away. And because she stood at the edge of the lane and watched for 20 minutes, and she saw a man come out the back door alone, check something at the far wall, and go back inside alone. And the alone was the thing she was looking for. Men alone in workplaces had less reason to perform cruelty for an audience. This was not trust. She had learned to mistrust trust. This was calculation. Between the back wall of the tannery and the old stone fence behind it, there was a gap, barely wide enough for a person. She fit into it with her knees against her chest and her arms around her knees and her face toward the stone, and she focused on breathing in a way that did not take up too much of the available air. She had not planned to stay more than one night, maybe two. His name, she learned later, was Aldrich. She learned it the way she learned most things in those first days, from a distance, through other people's mouths, from the quality of how a place spoke about someone when that someone was not in the room. The butcher's boy called out to him across the lane on the first morning. The woman at the bread stall 2 streets over used his name without looking up from her work, the way you use the name of someone you had known long enough that using it required no thought. She did not know his name yet on that first morning. On that first morning, she only knew what she had observed. He worked from before the light until after it. She could hear him through the back wall, the pull and drag of hides across wood surfaces, the rhythm of someone who had done the same work enough times that the rhythm had become its own kind of quiet. He did not hum, he did not talk to himself. He worked in a silence that was not the silence of someone suppressing noise, but the silence of someone who had decided that the volume of his presence was not a tool he needed to use. He came out the back door at the same time each evening. He checked the water barrel. He carried hides to the drying rack on the south wall, hung them with the methodical patience of someone who understood that the work would take as long as the work took, and there was no use in wanting it to take less. He went back inside. He latched the door. He did not look toward the gap. She was watching for the look. She was watching for any of the small signals, the angle of a head, the slight slowing of a step, the micro-adjustment of attention that people made when they were aware of something they were pretending not to be aware of. She had learned to read these signals with a precision that had kept her alive for 3 years. She did not see any of them. On the first evening, when he went back inside, she heard him moving around in the back room of the building for a while, then silence. Then after a period she estimated at 20 minutes, the back door opened again. He came out without a lantern. He set something on the ground just inside the door. He stood. He went back inside. He did not latch the door behind him fully. The door rested closed without catching, the way you might rest a door closed when you wanted to signal that the space was available and not claimed at the same time. She waited an hour before she moved. On the ground inside the door, there was a piece of bread. The middle piece, not the end. A clay cup of water. A small square of dried apple. She ate the bread in the dark with her back against the stone fence. She drank the water. She ate the dried apple one small piece at a time, the way you ate things when you were not sure when the next thing would come, which was also the way you ate things when something about the eating felt like a trap you had not yet identified, and you were leaving room to stop if you needed to. She moved the cup 2 inches to the left when she set it back down. She did not know why she did this. Her hands did it before she had decided to, maybe to see if he noticed. Maybe because moving the cup was the only response she had available that was not a sound or a word. In the morning, the cup had not moved back. She did not know what to do with this. She filed it away and watched. The second night, he left bread again. The third morning, she heard the door open early, heard the sound of a man moving with deliberate quiet, and when she checked later, there were 2 pieces instead of 1. She looked at the 2 pieces for a long time. She ate both of them. She had stopped expecting to be found comfortable. She had stopped expecting to be found and left alone in the same moment. Both of these things were happening, and her mind kept walking around the edges of them the way you walked around something you were not sure was solid enough to step on. The fourth day, the cold came in hard from the north before dawn. She had come around for the water barrel before first light, when the lane was empty. She had done it carefully, checking corners before she moved from shadow to shadow, setting her feet down the way she had learned to set them so the gravel did not shift. She filled the cup. She turned to go back. He was in the doorway. She stopped, not stepped back. Stopped completely, the way you stopped when the choice between the threat in front and the open space behind you was not yet resolved. He was holding a bundle of hides against his chest. His hands were visible, occupied. He had the kind of face that was hard to read quickly, not because it was closed, but because it was still. Not performing stillness, just still the way stone was still, because movement was not something it had decided to do. She watched his hands. She had learned to read hands before faces. Faces could lie faster than hands. Hands telegraphed the things people did not know they were thinking. His hands did not move. He did not shift his weight toward her. He did not open his mouth to make the sounds that men made when they found something unexpected and needed to claim the finding. He looked at the water barrel. He said quietly and without looking at her directly, "The way you spoke near something that might bolt. The barrel is there. The cup is yours." He went to the drying rack. He hung the hides. He kept his back to her. She understood, on some level she did not have words for yet, what it cost to keep your back to something you were uncertain of. She had spent 3 years unable to put her back to anything. She stood in the lane and watched him hang hides with his back to her, and she did not run, and he did not turn around. And when she finally walked back to the gap, she walked slowly enough that her footsteps could be heard clearly if he was listening. She wanted him to know where she was. She was not sure when she had decided that. The town found out on the 5th day. This was not a surprise. Towns the size of Heron Falls had a metabolism for information. Things moved through it the way cold moved through old stone, pervasively, and through all available channels simultaneously. She had known from the moment she settled in the gap that she would be known about. The question was only what would be done about the knowing. The woman from the bread stall appeared at Aldrich's front door on the 5th morning. Vesna could hear from the gap when the voices were at a certain angle and the wind was right. The woman's name was Hedda, 60-something, the voice of someone who had decided decades ago that being circumspect was a waste of everyone's time. "There is a girl behind your tannery," Hedda said. "Yes," Aldrich said. A pause. The sound of something being set on a table. "She needs more than bread," Hedda said. He said something Vesna could not fully hear. Hedda said something back. Then a longer silence. Then Hedda's footsteps leaving. An hour later, Hedda's footsteps returned. Something was placed on the table inside. The sound of it different from bread. Cloth, maybe. Then Hedda left again. That evening there was salted meat on the flat stone, and a hard-boiled egg, and a piece of cheese. No note, no explanation, no performance of generosity that would require acknowledgement. Vesna sat in the gap and looked at the food for a while. She thought about the 2 different pairs of hands that had prepared it, and the fact that neither of them had stood nearby to watch her take it. She ate the egg first because she had not had an egg in longer than she wanted to calculate. The man from the mill came to the pump on the 6th day when Aldrich was filling his bucket. She could hear them from the lane. The millman said something about orc women who ran from their clans. Said it with the tone of someone who believed they were delivering useful information rather than fear dressed in the clothes of concern. She waited to hear what Aldrich would say. He said, "The pump is drawing slow. Might need new leather on the seal." That was all. She sat in the gap for a long time after that, with the sound of that non-answer doing something in her chest that she could not name exactly. It was not warmth. She did not trust warmth. It was more like the adjustment you felt when you had been braced against something and something had not happened and your body had to reorganize itself around the absence of impact. The tavern owner came on the 7th evening, bigger voice than the millman, more direct. "She has been sleeping behind your place a week," the tavern man said. "What are you going to do about it?" "About what?" Aldrich said. "She is not harming anything. She is just there." A pause. She could hear Aldrich moving inside, the sound of his work continuing. "If it becomes a problem," he said, "I will address it. Right now, the only problem I have is that I need to reseal my water barrel, and I am short on pine pitch." She heard the tavern man leave. She heard the silence after he left. She filed all of it away. The catalog she was building of this man was growing, and it was not matching the catalog she had expected to build. On the 7th evening, Hedda came around to the back, not to the front door, around the back, which meant she had thought about which direction approached the gap and chose the one that would not cut off the exit. She stopped at the corner of the building. She did not come closer. She spoke to Aldrich, but loudly enough that anyone in the gap could hear. "There is a man asking questions in Millhaven," she said. "Orc man, big, scar through the left eyebrow. He is saying he is looking for a girl who belongs to him." A silence. Aldrich said, "How long ago?" 3 days, Hedda said. "Maybe 4 now." Another silence. Hedda set something on the flat stone. Vesna heard it and left. Her footsteps went back up the lane and disappeared into the evening. Millhaven was 3 days south by road. Vesna sat in the gap and let the numbers settle into her. 3 days. 4 now. She pressed her back against the cold stone and thought about Gorm's patience, which was not the frantic patience of someone who could not wait, but the settled patience of a man who had never had reason to rush because he had never believed the thing he was looking for would move faster than he did. He had been wrong about that once. He did not know it yet. That evening, when Vesna checked the flat stone, there was an additional piece of dried meat beside the usual bread. She looked at it for a moment, then at the closed door. Then she ate the meat and thought about which direction the road went north from Heron Falls, and whether the north road was better than staying, and whether staying was a calculation or something else that she did not have a word for yet. She did not leave that night. On the 8th evening, she watched him through the back window. The window was shuttered in the morning, open in the afternoon when the air inside needed somewhere to go. She had positioned herself at an angle in the gap where she could see into the back room of the workshop without being visible from the window directly. She could not see details. She could see the shape of the work, the pull and stretch of the hide, the long, slow draw of the blade when he was thinning leather, the way he stopped and looked at a piece and then continued without rushing, as if the leather had said something he needed to hear before he went on. She had seen someone work like this once before. Her grandmother had been a weaver. Not an important weaver, not someone whose work was traded or prized outside her own family. Just a woman who had worked thread for 40 years with the patience of someone who understood that you could not force the thing to be what it was not yet ready to be. You followed the thread where it wanted to go, and then, when it arrived, you made it mean something. She had not thought about her grandmother in over a year. She thought about her now, watching the shape of a man work through a back window in the fading light of a November afternoon, and the thinking felt different from the way most thinking felt lately. Not sharp with calculation, not weighted with threat assessment, just present. Just the memory of her grandmother's hands, existing in her mind the way things existed when there was room for them. On the 9th morning, Hedda appeared at the front of the tannery again. Longer this time. Vesna heard her voice carrying through the lane at the angle that let pieces through. Something about Thursday, something about eggs, something about coming back. She heard Aldrich's voice, quieter, and then Hedda saying something in the tone of someone who has decided a thing and is informing the other party of the decision that has already been made. Vesna noted that Aldrich did not argue. She noted that Hedda was the kind of woman who was allowed to appear without invitation and leave without explanation, and that this seemed to be a mutual arrangement that suited both parties without either of them having discussed it. On the 10th day, the morning came in bitter, the kind of cold that changed the quality of the air so that breathing it felt like something sharp. She had managed 9 nights in the gap. Her hands had stiffened again. The right one was the problem. The knuckles of the right hand had not opened or closed correctly since long before she came to Heron Falls, and the cold made the old break assert itself, made the joint between the second and third knuckles sit wrong, and wrong-sitting joints became slow joints, and slow hands were hands she could not trust. She came around for the water barrel. She was careful, the way she was always careful, reading the lane before she moved, setting her feet before she committed to the step. She filled the cup. She turned. He was in the doorway, same as the 4th day, bundle of hides in his hands occupied and visible. She did not freeze this time. She held the cup in both hands and looked at him from across the width of the back lane. He looked at her the way he looked at things that required him to be accurate rather than quick. Still, patient, not waiting for her to do something, just present in the doorway with the hides in his arms and the morning behind him. She said why. Not a full question, just the word, flat, without angle. He considered it the way he considered everything, not reaching for an answer, going toward the honest one. You were hungry, he said. She waited. She had trained herself across 3 years to hear the continuation. The part where the giving became visible as the first piece of a longer architecture. I gave you this, and now you owe me this. The architecture of debt, which was what she had learned generosity usually was. There was no continuation. He shifted the bundle of hides and looked toward the drying rack with the expression of someone who had things to do and was going to go do them. She said, "You do not know me." "No," he said. Then he walked to the drying rack and began hanging hides. She stood in the lane for a long time with the cup of water in both hands and the cold in her fingers and the absence of the expected thing sitting in the air like something she did not have a word for. A man who gave something without watching to see what would come back. She had known men who were kind. She had known men who brought things and smiled and used the word help the way other people use the word owed. She had not known, or could not remember knowing, a man who left a space empty where the condition was supposed to be. She went back to the gap. She sat with her back against the cold stone and her cup of water in her stiff hands, and she thought about the empty space where the condition had not arrived. She thought about it carefully, the way she thought about things she had not finished cataloging yet, without deciding what it was before she had enough information. She did not leave that day. She did not leave the next day either. The staying was not a decision. It was the absence of a decision to go. These were not the same thing. But the result was the same, and at the end of the 10th day she was still in the gap, and Gorm was somewhere south of Millhaven counting the days, and Aldrich had hung his hides and gone back inside, and the flat stone beside the water barrel held bread and something warm wrapped in cloth that turned out, when she opened it, to be a piece of cooked cornbread that was still faintly warm from someone's oven. She ate it in the dark. She looked at the back window of the tannery, shuddered for the night. She thought about the man behind it who had said you were hungry, as if that were a complete and sufficient explanation for everything he had done, and who had then gone back to work as if the explanation required no further defense, no elaboration, no waiting to see what she would do with it. She thought about her grandmother's hands moving through thread without forcing it. She pulled her coat tighter and watched the shuttered window, and did not think about Gorm, and did not think about the number of days, and let herself, for the first time since she had left, not be anywhere but exactly where she was. The cold was still there. So was she. That night she slept before she decided to, which was something she noted when she woke, because in 3 years sleeping had always been a deliberate act, something permitted and rationed and positioned carefully. It had never simply arrived. She lay in the gap and looked at the sky going from black to gray and thought about sleep arriving without being invited, and filed that too in the catalog she was building of things in Heron Falls that did not behave the way she had learned things behaved. The catalog was getting long. She was not sure what to do with how long it was getting. She stayed another day, and then another. And the staying accumulated in the way that things accumulated when you stopped measuring them against a departure that kept not happening, until you looked back one morning and realized that what you had been doing, without naming it, was choosing to remain. Gorm arrived in Heron Falls on the 12th day, but Vesna did not know this yet. She learned it the way she learned most things, through the gap between what was said and what was not said, through the quality of silences that changed when information was moving through a place. She had been watching the town long enough now to know its rhythms. The market lane was loud before mid-morning and quieter after. The mill ran a particular pattern on Tuesdays. Hedda's bread stall drew its heaviest traffic in the first 2 hours after dawn, and in those 2 hours, Hedda stood at the center of more information than anyone in Heron Falls would have admitted to tracking. She did not know about Gorm on the 12th day. What she knew on the 12th day was that Aldrich had sent word to the healer. She knew this because Hedda had come to the tannery that morning and said something through the front wall that Vesna caught only in pieces, but the pieces included the word Ren and the word Thursday and what sounded like Aldrich saying, "I asked her to come by if she was willing." Vesna sat in the gap and thought about this. A man who sent for a healer without asking first whether a healer was wanted. This was a thing that could be done with good intentions and poor instincts. She had known this combination before. The gap between wanting to help and understanding that help was not the same as deciding. She waited to see which kind this was. The healer came on the 14th day in the late afternoon. Her name was Ren. She was small and human, with gray threading through dark hair, and the economy of movement that came from decades of work in small rooms with people who needed careful handling. She came around to the back of the tannery, not the front. She stopped at the edge of the back lane and she did not look toward the gap directly. She said to the general air, in a voice calibrated to carry without demanding, "I am Ren. I am the healer here. Aldrich asked me to come." Vesna was still. Ren continued, unhurried. "He did not tell me much. He said there was someone who might need to have their hands looked at. He said he thought you would know what you needed and what you didn't, and that he didn't want to decide that for you. She paused. She set a small leather roll on the flat stone. If you don't want to see me, she said, I'll leave the kit and go. It has what you'd need for most things. If you want to talk, I'll be at the front of the tannery for a few minutes. She left. Her footsteps went around the building and disappeared. Vesna sat in the gap and looked at the leather roll on the stone. He did not want to decide that for you. She turned the words over the way you turned a stone over to see what was underneath it. She had heard the word decide used as a kindness before. She had heard it used the way people used all kinds of words when what they actually meant was, I have already decided and I am informing you of this now. She read the words again in the silence of the gap, stripped of tone and facial expression, just the words themselves and what they carried. He had sent someone. He had sent someone and then removed himself, and the someone he had sent had stood at a respectful distance and used the word decide as if it were something that belonged to Vesna and not to the people around her. Her right hand had not closed correctly in 14 days of cold. She came out of the gap. She picked up the leather roll. She walked around to the front of the tannery. Ren was standing to the side of the front door, not blocking it, not leaning on it. Standing beside it in the posture of someone who had learned that doors should belong to the person on the inside. Aldrich was not in sight. He left, Ren said, reading Vesna's eyes without making a performance of reading them. Went to pick up an order from the mill. He'll be back when the work is done. Vesna looked at the leather roll in her hands. My hands, she said. The right one. The knuckles don't close right. May I see? The offering of the hand required the overriding of an instruction so old and deep, she could not remember when it had been written into her. She held it out. Ren looked at it without touching first. She examined it the way Aldrich examined leather, not forcing a conclusion, looking for what was actually there. Her eyes moved across the knuckles, the set of the joint, the way the fingers held their resting angle. Hold break, Ren said, between the second and third knuckle. It's set wrong. How long ago? 2 years. Ren nodded. She did not ask how. She asked the body the way the body allowed itself to be asked, without wanting the story behind it. May I? Vesna nodded. Ren's hands were careful and impersonal in the way that was not coldness, but its own kind of respect. The respect of someone who had separated their own feelings from their hands, because their hands had a job that feelings would complicate. The examination took a long time. Ren moved through it methodically without commentary that would require response. She found the bruised rib that Vesna had not mentioned. She found the ear that still rang faintly on the left side in certain kinds of quiet. She found the old scar on the inside of the left wrist and looked at it once, fully, and then moved on. Moving on was exactly the right thing to do. Vesna noted this. When she was finished, Ren sat back and looked at her directly. Are you safe? Safer than I was, Vesna said, which was true and not a full answer. Ren seemed to understand both things without requiring them to be untangled. All right, she said. She began wrapping the right hand in a method that was different from anything Vesna had experienced. Not binding, supporting. The difference between the two was significant, and Vesna felt it in the first wrap. The difference between being held still and being held in a position that allowed for movement. This will pull for a few days, Ren said. That's normal. It's asking the tissue to remember a different position. Will it work? Not fully, but better. She tied the last knot. Then she did the thing Vesna had not expected. She said, these marks, indicating the scar on the left wrist with a slight tilt of her head, without touching it again, they show that you were protecting yourself. Vesna went still. Not the stillness of fear, a different stillness. The stillness of something that had been said that she did not know how to put down again once she had picked it up. For 3 years, she had carried the story of that scar as evidence of her own failure, of what she had not been fast enough or strong enough to prevent. She had never had occasion to consider it differently because no one had ever offered her the different consideration. No one had looked at the evidence and read it toward her instead of against her. You were protecting yourself, not you failed to stop it, not look what happened to you, not I'm sorry, which people said when they meant I am uncomfortable with this information and I would like to conclude it now. You were protecting yourself. Ren packed her kit. Do you want me to come back? Vesna looked at her wrapped hand. The tightness was different, not gone, redirected. Yes, she said. The word came out before she had finished deciding to say it. I'll come on Thursdays, Wren said. You don't have to be where I can see you. Just be where you can hear me. We'll work from there. She left without further instruction, without advice about what Vesna should do next, without any of the things people attach to help, when help was also a form of ownership. Vesna sat on the outside front step of the tannery with her wrapped hand in her lap. She had not sat on the front step before. It was further into the open than she had been in 2 weeks. She sat there anyway and looked at the hand and thought about the word protect and let it be a different word than it had been before. She was still sitting there when Aldrich came back from the mill. He stopped when he saw her. Not with surprise, or if it was surprise, he did not perform it. He looked at her the way he looked at things that required accuracy rather than speed. Wren came, she said. Yes, he said. You sent her. I asked her. He looked at the wrapped hand briefly. You didn't have to see her. I know, she said. He went to the door, unlocked it, went inside. He left the door open. She sat on the step for a while longer. The door was open behind her. It was not an invitation and it was not a demand. It was a door that happened to be open on an afternoon that happened to be cold, and it happened to be open in the direction she happened to be sitting. She went inside. She did not go far. She stood near the door, which she established could be reached in 2 steps, and looked at the room. The stretching frames against the far wall, the long table with its tools organized with the precision of someone who knew where everything was and needed to keep knowing. The smell was strong here, but honest in the way that work smells were honest. It did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. Aldrich was at the table working on a small piece of leather with a curved tool. He did not look up. She stood near the door and looked at the room and understood that she was allowed to leave it whenever she chose. This was not something she had been told. It was something she was learning to read. The difference between a space that held you and a space that simply existed around you. Why do you work alone, she asked. He looked up, not startled, considered. The work is better when no one is talking, he said. Most people don't like silence. I am not most people. Something moved in his expression. Not a smile. The geography of one, the landscape of a face rearranging itself to allow for the possibility. Sit if you want, he said. He nodded toward a stool near the wall, not near his table, near the wall. She looked at the stool. She looked at the distance between the stool and him. She sat. She watched him work. He did not perform the working. He just worked. The curved tool moved along the leather's edge with the patience of someone who had stopped expecting the work to be done faster than it could be done. She watched his hands, the left one with the dye stain from wrist to elbow that she had cataloged on the first day. The stain was part of him now, the way old work became part of the people who did it. She looked at the tools on the table, organized but not rigid, adjusted for where he was in the work, for what came next. The organization of someone who understood their own process. How long have you been a tanner, she said. 12 years. Did you choose it? He paused. It chose me, he said, which was not evasive but was not simple either. She moved slightly further from the door, 2 steps, not toward him, toward the wall where the finished pieces hung. Bridles, straps, a saddle frame not yet complete. She looked at them. These are good, she said. They work, he said. That is the same thing. He looked at her then. Something moved in his expression again. The thing before a smile when the idea of it arrives before the permission to have it. She went back to the stool. She sat. She watched him work, and he did not perform the working. And outside the town made its evening sounds, and neither of them needed to fill the silence, and so they did not. What is your name? He said without looking up. She had not told him. 14 days and she had not told him. Vesna, she said. He nodded. Aldrich, he said, and the almost thing in his face again. Brief, honest. They sat in the silence that had become something other than empty. The tool moved. The leather took shape. Outside, the baker was shutting her oven. Someone called a name across the lane. The mill's distant rhythm continued as it did through every kind of weather and every kind of day. She went back to the Gap that night, but she went later than usual. She sat longer before she went. The sitting longer was not a decision either. It was just what her body did when it was no longer certain that leaving was more necessary than staying. She looked at the stool near the wall on her way out. She noted the distance between the stool and the door. 2 steps to the door from the stool was the same 2 steps as from most places in the front room. She had measured them all. She went back to the gap. She did not leave the next day or the one after that. On the 15th day, Aldrich repaired her left boot. The sole had been splitting at the heel since before she arrived in Heron Falls, and she had been compensating for it in her stride the way you compensated for things when you could not afford to address them, by adjusting everything else around the problem. Hedda had noticed first, because Hedda noticed the things that needed addressing before people admitted they needed addressing, and she had mentioned it to Aldrich with the directness she applied to everything. And the next morning, when Vesna came around for the water barrel, Aldrich was in the doorway and said simply, "The boot. I can fix it if you want." She sat on the stool near the wall and handed him the boot and watched him work. He separated the sole from the upper without damaging either, working carefully at the junction the way you worked carefully at things that could not be forced without being ruined. He cleaned the edges. He selected the right weight of thread for the stitching. She watched him consider 2 different spools before choosing. The choosing done with attention rather than habit. She was watching his hands. He noticed. He did not say stop watching. He said, without looking up, 5 different hides. The brown hasn't left in 3 years. It's just skin now. He held up his left hand briefly, the dye stain from wrist to elbow, exactly as she had cataloged it, and then went back to the stitching. She understood what he was doing. He was giving her information about his hands because she was watching them, and he had noticed, and he had decided without being asked, that the thing she needed was information rather than reassurance that the information was unnecessary. These were different things. Most people offered reassurance. This was information. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. The boot took 2 hours. When he was done, he set it on the table. The sole tight, the stitching even, the kind of work that would hold through seasons. "Thank you," she said. The words came out differently than she expected. Weighted in the way words were weighted when they were said to someone you had decided could hear them properly. "It's a good boot," he said. "Worth fixing." She turned it in her hands and thought about worth and fixing, and the particular economy of someone who looked at a thing that had been damaged and saw in it not the damage, but the thing the damage had not yet managed to ruin. On the 16th day, she began staying closer to the open. Not visible from the lane, but closer to the edge of the gap where the afternoon light came in. She sat in the light and worked on her hands. The stretching Wren had shown her. The slow opening and closing of the right knuckle against resistance. The way you asked damaged tissue to remember something it had been made to forget. She was doing this on the morning of the 17th day when Hedda came around the back. Hedda stopped at the edge of the lane. She looked at Vesna sitting in the light with her hands extended. She did not make a sound of discovery. She looked at the hands the way Wren had looked at them, as information, not as evidence of something she had already decided. "You are working them," Hedda said. "Yes." "Good." She set her basket down and sat on the low stone wall at the edge of the lane with the ease of a woman who had been sitting on low walls her whole life and had no intention of stopping. She pulled a round of dough from the basket. She began working it with her hands, the kind of absent working that people did when their hands needed to be busy while their mind was doing something else. "Do you know how to braid bread?" she said. "No, I'll show you. It is not useful in most ways. It is useful in the way of things that your hands remember after your mind has stopped thinking about them." She did not ask if Vesna wanted to learn. She simply began showing her, with the matter-of-fact delivery of someone who had decided this was going to happen. Vesna watched. Then Hedda handed her a piece of the dough and she tried. Her right hand moved stiffly. Hedda watched without commenting on the stiffness and adjusted her instruction to work around it without calling attention to the adjustment. They worked in the lane for a while. "My grandmother was a weaver," Vesna said. The words came out before she had decided to say them. Hedda did not look up from the dough. What did she weave? Blankets? Tablecloths? She had a pattern she made for 40 years, the same repeating line. "I used to watch her hands when I was small." Hedda nodded, the kind of nod that was not commentary but acknowledgement, that the things said had been heard and witnessed and did not require response, just presence. Vesna looked at the braid forming under her hands. The stiff right hand was learning the shape of it despite the stiffness. Hedda was right. There was something about the repetition that moved into the hands and stayed. She thought about her grandmother. She had not thought about her in a long time. She let herself think about her now, here in the afternoon light of the back lane, with her hands working dough into a shape that was not her grandmother's shape, but came from the same impulse, the human need to make something that held together. On the 18th day, the night turned cold enough that the gap, which she had managed for more than 2 weeks, became a different kind of problem. She lay in the gap for 2 hours and ran the calculation. Cold on one side, inside on the other. She had done versions of this calculation before. 2 years ago, a year ago, the night she finally ran. She knew how it felt when it resolved. It felt like the moment you stopped measuring and started moving. She was cold. There was a warm place. She was going into it. She knocked on the back door. This surprised her as she was doing it. Her hand knocked before her mind had finished agreeing to knock. The door opened. Aldrich looked at her face first, then her hands where the cold had made the skin tight over the knuckles. He stepped back. He opened the door wider. There was a pallet near the front wall, not against the back wall where his own room was. Near the front, close to the front door, with 2 blankets folded on top. The folding was recent, not the kind of recent that had been waiting for days, but the kind of recent that had been done tonight, this evening, in the time between when he had gone to bed and when she had knocked. She looked at the pallet. She looked at him. "I thought the cold might make it necessary," he said. "You don't have to use it." She looked at the front door. 2 steps. She looked at the window on the front wall. The latch was open. She had checked it from the outside 2 days ago without being entirely sure why she was checking. She sat on the pallet. He went to the back room. She heard him settle. She sat on the pallet for a long time with her back against the wall and the front door in her line of sight, and counted the sounds of the building adjusting itself around 2 people instead of one. She lay down. She did not close her eyes for a while. She lay with the blanket over her and the door visible and listened to the building's sounds, the creak of old wood settling in the cold, the distant rhythm of the mill, the specific quiet that filled a space when the work had stopped for the day and the space held only the memory of it. At some point, the deciding stopped and the sleeping came on its own, which was different from any night she could remember in 3 years, because in 3 years, sleeping had always been something she permitted herself rather than something that simply arrived. It had never come without being summoned. She woke in the night once, disoriented, and found the door where she had left it, 2 steps visible, unlocked, and lay back down and let the building sounds continue, and slept again. In the morning, Hedda was at the front door before Aldrich had opened the shutters. Vesna heard the knock from the pallet. She sat up the moment the knock came, which was reflex, which was also survival. She heard Aldrich's footsteps. She heard the door. She heard Hedda's voice doing what Hedda's voice did when she was performing casualness and actually meant something else entirely. "I brought bread," Hedda said. "You bring bread every week," Aldrich said. "This is more bread." A pause. "Come in." Hedda came in. She looked at the pallet. She looked at Vesna sitting upright on the pallet with her hands visible and her body positioned toward the door. She looked at Aldrich. She made several decisions very quickly in the compressed way that people of a certain age and temperament made decisions. Not because they were rash, but because they had accumulated enough information about the world that the calculation ran faster. "I am Hedda," she said to Vesna. Vesna said nothing. "You don't have to talk to me," Hedda said. "I talk enough for several people. It has been mentioned on multiple occasions by people whose opinions I respect moderately." She set the bread on the table and looked around the workshop with the eye of a woman assessing a space that had needs she intended to meet. "You need more blankets," she said to Aldrich. "She's fine, I'm sure she is. She would be finer with more blankets." She looked at Vesna. "Do you like eggs?" Vesna blinked. "What?" "Eggs. Do you like them?" "I have chickens. The chickens are producing more than I can use. The eggs need to go somewhere or they become a philosophical problem about intention and waste, and I do not have time for that kind of problem this week." Vesna looked at her. "Yes," she said. "Good." Hedda nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had expected this answer. "I'll bring some. Is there anything else you need that this one," she indicated Aldrich without looking at him, "has not thought to ask about because he thinks asking is the same as demanding?" "My boots," Vesna said. The words came out before she had processed whether she was going to say them. "The left one." The sole is splitting at the heel. Hedda looked at Aldrich. I can fix it, he said. Of course you can, Hedda said. You fix everything that doesn't require you to have a conversation first. She picked up her basket. I'll be back Thursday. She left. The lane outside received her footsteps and swallowed them into the market sounds. Vesna looked at Aldrich. She does that often, she said. Every week, he said. Sometimes twice. And you let her. Stopping Hedda is like stopping weather. You can go inside, but the weather still comes. Something moved in Vesna's face, not a smile. The shape that existed just before a smile when the idea of it arrived before the permission. She handed him the other boot. On the 20th day, rain came in from the northwest in the early afternoon and continued into the night. The kind of steady rain that made old buildings contract around their own warmth and turned the sound of the outside world into something distant and manageable. Aldrich was oiling a saddle near the stove. The oil moved slowly in the cold, and he worked it in with the flat of his thumb, section by section, the way you worked something when you were not in a hurry and were not pretending not to be in a hurry. Vesna was at the table mending one of his work aprons. The left side had developed a split along the seam that he had been ignoring in the way he ignored things that did not interfere with the immediate work. She had noticed it 3 days ago. She was fixing it now because her hands needed something to do and the apron needed fixing, and both of these facts were true at the same time. She said, I'm scared of men. She had not planned to say this. It came out the way other true things had come out, the body saying what it knew before the mind had finished agreeing to say it. Aldrich kept oiling the saddle. He did not stop and look at her. He did not make the sounds that people made when they felt they needed to perform a response to a difficult statement. The intake of breath, the repositioning, the gathering of words that announced themselves as gathered. He said, yes. She said, and you. She stopped. Started again. You haven't. No, he said. Why not? Most men, he said, his thumb continuing along the leather, see fear and decide what it means and then act according to their decision. I'd rather wait and see what you need and then act according to that. She was quiet for a moment. The needle moved through the canvas. The rain hit the shutter steadily. That is not how men are, she said. I can only speak for myself. Have you always been this way? He was quiet for longer than his usual quiet. The oil worked into the saddle. The stove made its small sounds. No, he said, I learned it. From what? He looked up then. The same still face, not performing openness. Being honest because honesty was what the moment required. From what it cost to be different, he said. From watching what happened when I wasn't. He looked back at the saddle. I was not always patient. I was not always careful about the weight of my presence. I learned what it cost other people, and I decided I didn't want to cost people things. Your wife, she said, not an accusation, a recognition. He nodded, among other things. She set the needle down. She looked at him directly for the first time during this conversation, which had not been easy to do while the words were coming out of him, because looking directly at someone while they were being honest required a kind of steadiness she had only recently begun to find. She had expected a story of victimhood, a wife who left without reason, a man wronged by circumstances. That was the story men told about themselves when they explained why they were alone. She had heard versions of it before, the story that absolved the teller before it had finished being told. He had not told that story. He had told the other one, the one where he was the weight, where he was the pressure that made a room smaller than it needed to be. Not violent, he had not said violent, and she believed the absence of the word because of the way he was careful about every word he used, but heavy, present in a way that did not leave enough air for the person beside him. And he had spent 6 years since then becoming someone who understood the difference. She picked up the needle again. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would not diminish what he had just given her, which was not comfort and not reassurance, but the specific thing she had not known she needed. Evidence that a man could look honestly at the damage he had caused and choose, without being asked, to become the kind of person who did not cause it again. Not because someone made him, not because it was required, because he had decided it mattered. She had not known that was possible. She was holding it up now and looking at what it was made of. I have been scared for 3 years, she said. It's not something you decide to stop. No, he said, Even here, even when everything is, she stopped. She did not finish this because she was not sure what word went at the end of it. It's still there in the morning, she said instead. Every morning I wake up and for a second I don't know where I am. I know, he said. She looked at him. How? Because you count the steps to the door. He said it without looking up. Every room you've been in since you came here, you count the steps to the door. I've seen you do it. She had not known she was visible doing it. She had believed it was internal, something no one could observe. Does it bother you, she said. No, why not? Because it means you're thinking about what you need, he said. That's not a problem. That's sense, Ubarit. She sat with this for a while. The mending was almost done. She turned the apron to reach the last of the split seam. It might not go away, she said. The fear, it might always be there. Yes, he said, it might. He set the saddle aside. He looked at her, not the way people looked at things they were trying to evaluate, but the way people looked at things they had decided were worth being accurate about. You asked if it bothers me. It doesn't. Whatever you carry, you carry. I'm not asking you to put it down. She looked at the mended apron in her hands. The stitch was good. She had done it carefully with the attention you gave to things when you cared whether they lasted. It was in this quiet, with the rain on the shutters and the stove's warmth and the mended apron in her hands, that she heard something from the lane outside. Not a sound exactly, the absence of one. The specific silence that the lane held when someone had stopped moving through it instead of passing through. She had learned to read this silence during 3 years of needing to know the difference between someone passing and someone pausing. She did not move. She looked at the shuttered window. Aldrich had heard it too. He was still in the way. He went still when he was listening, which was different from his usual stillness, a degree more precise, more directed. The silence in the lane resolved after a moment into footsteps moving away. Toward the tavern, by the direction. Neither of them said anything about it. She went to sleep that night on the pallet with the front door 2 steps away, and the rain still falling, and the mended apron on the table, and the phrase, whatever you carry, sitting in her mind like something she intended to come back to and examine more carefully when she had the space for it. The next morning she learned who had been in the lane. She heard it at the edge of Hedda's stall. She had started going to the market in the early hours when the crowds were sparse and the movement patterns were predictable. She stayed at the edges. She listened the way she had always listened, not for what was said, but for what was carried inside what was said. A woman from the mill, talking to a neighbor 2 stalls down. There was a stranger at Cade's last night. Big orc man, scar through the left eyebrow. Asking Cade who lived where, who worked alone, whether there were any orc women recently come to the area. Vesna stood at the edge of the market lane and felt the cold that had nothing to do with the morning temperature. She did not run. She had run before. She knew what running looked like from the inside, and she knew that right now, running would take her out into the open with no information about where he was or which direction he would move. Running was what you did when you had no better option. She had a better option. She walked back to the tannery. She went into the front door. Aldrich looked up from the stretching frame. She said, he's here. Big, scar through the left eyebrow, gray traveling cloak. He'll smell like the road. He went to Cade's first, which means Cade knows he's looking for someone, and Cade will tell him what he knows because that is what Cade does with information. Aldrich was quiet. He absorbed this the way he absorbed everything, without rushing to a response, arranging it into something he could be accurate about. He said, all right. She looked at him. She had spent 21 days building a catalog of this man's behavior, and the catalog kept refusing to resolve into the shape she had expected it to resolve into. The all right was a container for more than its 2 syllables, and she was learning to read the containers. You should know, she said, that he is patient. He does not rush. He believes the thing he is looking for will still be there when he arrives. He has been wrong before, Aldrich said. She looked at him. He went back to the stretching frame. She went to the stool near the wall. She sat. The distance to the door was 2 steps, and she knew it. And she sat in the workshop with that knowledge and thought about the 22 days behind her and what they had accumulated into. And she did not run. Outside, the morning went on. The market sounds continued. Somewhere across the lane, at Cade's tavern, a large orc man with a scar through his left eyebrow was drinking something and calculating his next move with the patience of someone who had never had reason to hurry. He had been wrong about that once. He was about to be wrong again. The morning of the 22nd day came in gray and still. Not the sharp cold of the previous weeks, something flatter. The kind of morning that withheld itself, that gave nothing away early. Vesna had been awake before the light, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that she had lain on the pallet without counting, without reaching for the door with her mind before her body had opened its eyes. She had lain still and let the building sounds come to her instead of going to meet them, and for the first minutes of the day, she had simply existed in the room without measuring it. Then she remembered, and she counted. 3 steps, same as always. She was at the stretching frame when it started. Aldrich had a piece of harness leather that needed working on both sides, and she had learned enough in the past days of watching and helping to know which end to hold and how much tension to keep in the grip. They had been at it for an hour in the kind of silence that had become, without announcement, a different kind of silence than it had been before. Not the silence of 2 people being careful around each other. The silence of 2 people who had found a way to occupy the same space without the occupying being a problem. She heard it before she identified it. A change in the lane outside, the compression of sound that happened when someone paused at a destination rather than passed through. She had heard this once before in the rain, and that time it had resolved into footsteps moving away. This time it held, the dense, patient quiet of someone who had arrived and was taking their time about announcing it. Her hands stopped on the leather. Aldrich noticed. He looked at her face, then at the front window, and his expression made the small shift it made when he was moving from one kind of attention to another. He finished the lacing on his side of the frame. She said quietly, "Gray cloak, scar through the left eyebrow." He nodded. He looked at her for a moment, not asking, making the silence available to her, the way he made things available without requiring her to take them. "Stay here," he said, "or go if you need to go. The back lane connects to the mill road. The mill road goes north." She looked at him. "I'm not telling you to stay," he said. "I'm telling you what your options are." She stayed. He went to the front window, not to open it, to listen. She could hear it too from across the workshop. The voice outside assembling itself into a claim, the way voices did when they were gathering pieces that would become ownership stated as fact. She heard the word orc. She heard the word mine. She heard the pause that followed, which was Aldrich standing at the window saying nothing, which was its own kind of answer to something that had not been politely asked. 22 days ago, she would have been out the back door before the word mine had finished sounding. She would have been on the mill road already, moving north, calculating the gap between herself and the sound behind her. The running had kept her alive for 2 days of frozen road. The running had been the only thing she trusted. She was standing in the workshop with her back to the sidewall and the front door 2 steps away, and she was not running. She was not entirely sure when that had changed. She was not sure it had fully changed, but she was here, and she had counted, and she was not using the count. Aldrich came back from the window. "He's at Cade's," he said. "Cade is talking, which Cade will do." "I know," she said. "What do you want to happen?" She looked at him. No one had asked her this before. Not in the 3 years before she ran, and not in the 22 days since. What she wanted, as if what she wanted was a thing that existed and could be named and then acted upon. As if her wanting was information that mattered to the outcome. She let herself think about it. She let the question be real instead of deflecting it because the answer seemed impossible. She stood in the workshop and let herself think about what she actually wanted. "I want him to know I am not his," she said. "I want there to be a witness. Someone who can say she was here and she was asked and she said no, and the no was heard." Aldrich nodded. "All right," he said. "Then that is what will happen." The knock came 20 minutes later. Aldrich opened the door. Gorm was larger than she had described him, which was not because she had described him inaccurately. It was because a man like Gorm expanded to fill whatever threshold he occupied. He stood in the doorway, and the doorway was the right size for a door and the wrong size for what was standing in it. The gray cloak, the scar through the left eyebrow, old and silver now. The road smell that had soaked into him through 11 days of moving south to north. His eyes moved past Aldrich immediately. When he found her, something happened in his face that she had seen before and had spent 3 years hoping never to see again. Not anger, which would have been simpler, but the relief of a man who locates the thing he has been looking for and begins immediately calculating what comes next. The relief of someone whose certainty has been confirmed. Vesna, he said. The word carried everything. The whole 3 years of it. The weight of her name in his mouth, which was not the weight of someone speaking a person's name, but the weight of someone stating a possession. She is not who you're looking for, Aldrich said. Gorm looked at him then. The assessment was fast and dismissive. The practiced look of a man who dealt with obstacles by deciding they were smaller than they were. I know who I'm looking for. Then you know she's standing in my workshop, Aldrich said. Standing there because she chose to. The choosing was hers. She is clan, Gorm said. She left. Aldrich said it the way you said something that was only required to be true. Not louder, not differently weighted. Just the fact, placed where the other words had been. She left, he said again. That is what you said about her. She left. If she left, then she decided to leave. If she decided, then the decision was hers. Gorm's jaw tightened. You don't understand our ways. I understand that she is standing here and not standing with you, Aldrich said, and that she has not moved toward you since you appeared, and that she has not said your name the way a person said the name of someone they wanted to go back to. He looked at Vesna then, not asking. The silence was hers. Is there anything you want to say to him? She had thought, on the nights in the poem and the nights on the pallet, about what she would say if she could say anything. She had practiced the arguments. She had accumulated 3 years of words she had not been allowed to speak. A whole architecture of sentences built in the dark of rooms she had not been allowed to leave. She said, I am not yours. 3 words. She had the others ready and she did not need them. These 3 were the ones that were true and complete and did not require the others to hold their shape. Gorm looked at her for a long time. His expression moved through several things. The relief first, then the calculation that followed relief, then something harder underneath the calculation, and then, underneath the harder thing, something she had never let herself look for before because looking for it had seemed like a thing she could not afford. The specific expression of a man who has called something his for so long that he has forgotten it was never his, and is being told this fact in a room where someone else is listening. He left. He did not say anything else. He turned and left, and the door closed behind him, and the lane outside accepted his footsteps, and then the footsteps faded into the ordinary sounds of Heron Falls going about its morning. Aldrich closed the door. Vesna stood in the middle of the workshop for a long time. Her hands were shaking. She had not noticed them shaking until Gorm was gone, which was the way fear worked. You held the outside of yourself together while the thing was present, and afterward your hands told you what the holding had cost. She looked at her hands, the right one still slightly stiff from the old break. Both of them trembling with the fine tremor of a body releasing something it had been clenching without knowing it was clenched. Aldrich set a cup of water on the table near her. Not in her hand. Near her. He went back to the stretching frame. She picked up the cup. She drank. The water was cold and real, and she held the cup in both shaking hands and drank it and stood in the workshop and let her hands shake because they had earned it. Then she went to her place at the frame and held the next piece of leather. They worked until the light went. On the 23rd day, Cade came to the tannery. He came in the late afternoon when the market was closing and the lane was quieter. He had the expression of a man delivering information he believed was important, and was also, at least slightly, enjoying the importance of delivering. He asked for Aldrich at the front door, and Vesna, who was at the table with a small piece of edging work, heard the conversation through the open interior doorway. Gorm had not left Heron Falls. He was at Cade's tavern, Cade said, drinking slowly, saying little. Had taken a room for a few days. Said he would give her time to think it over. Said she would come back when she had thought clearly. He said it the way men said things they had decided were facts before they happened. Vesna heard this. She heard Aldrich say thank you. She heard Cade's footsteps retreating. She heard the front door close. She heard Aldrich come back into the workshop. She set down the edging tool. She waited. He went to the back table. He picked up a piece of work he had set aside that morning. He began on it. She waited through the sound of work. She waited through the silence of something not being said. She said, he didn't leave. A pause. No, Aldrich said. She looked at him. He was looking at the work in front of him. His hands were moving, but they had changed quality. The slight stiffness that entered hands when the mind was occupied with something the hands were not fully in. You knew before now, she said. He set the work down. Cade told me last night, he said. She was quiet. The workshop held the sound of both of them breathing and nothing else. You decided not to tell me. He looked at her then. Yes. She thought about the word decide. She thought about all the times in 3 years that word had been used by people who believed that deciding belonged to them. She thought about the distance between good intentions and what they produced when they did not stop to ask. You decided I couldn't handle knowing, she said, that I needed to be protected from the information. She looked at him steadily. That is exactly what I ran from. Not just him, the deciding. Men deciding what I could hear, what I was strong enough to carry, what I needed to be kept from knowing. You decided for me. Aldrich did not argue. He did not explain. He did not offer the architecture of his reasons in the hope that the architecture would soften the conclusion. He said, "You're right, I was wrong. Not, I was only trying to help. Not, you have to understand what I was thinking. Just the fact of the error, placed without defense in the space between them." She stood in the workshop for a longer time. Her hands were not shaking. They were still, and the stillness was not the frozen stillness of fear, but the stillness of someone standing in their own anger and finding that the anger had a shape and the shape was legitimate. She was allowed to be angry. She was allowed to name what it was. Both of these things were true at the same time. She did not leave. She stood for a while longer, and then she sat down on the stool near the wall, not because the sitting meant she had decided something, because she was making her own decisions now, and sitting was the one she made. Aldrich picked up the work again. He did not look at her with relief. He did not breathe out the way people breathed out when a difficult moment had passed and they were glad to be on the other side of it. He simply worked with the same quality of attention he brought to everything's. The quality of someone who understood that a moment was not over just because the loudest part of it had finished. She sat on the stool for a while. Then she went back to the table. She picked up the edging tool. She worked. The edging was clean. She had taken her time with it. Not because she had been asked to, because it mattered to her that it was good. And mattering was something she had not expected to feel about work that was not hers to keep. On the 25th day, Gorm came back. Vesna knew before she saw him. She had spent 3 years learning the way a space changed when he was moving through it. The compression of the air. The way other people's behavior shifted at the edge of their awareness when something large and certain was approaching. She felt it at the back of the workshop where she was working on a piece of strap leather. And she knew. She put the tool down. She walked to the front of the workshop. Aldrich was at the main table. He looked up when she came forward. He read her face. She said, "He's coming." He stood. He moved toward the front door. She said, "Wait." He stopped. She stood in the middle of the workshop and thought about the 25 days behind her and the 3 years behind those. She thought about what she had asked for on the day Gorm first came to the door. A witness, someone who could say she was here, and she said no, and the no was heard. She had wanted that witness in this room, 4 walls around her, Aldrich between her and the door. She understood now that it was not enough. She went to the front door. She opened it. She walked out onto the front step, and she kept walking until she was standing in the lane itself, in the open, in the full gray morning light of Heron Falls. The lane was not empty. Hedda was at the corner of the market, basket over her arm, stopped mid-step in the way she stopped. When something required the full attention she was always prepared to give. Wren was coming up the lane from the healer's house, her kit bag over one shoulder. Cade was in the doorway of his tavern across the way, the door half open, watching. Rook, who ran the mill, had stopped his cart at the lane's edge and was standing beside it with the stillness of a man who had decided not to move until he understood what was happening. And Gorm was at the far end of the lane, 10 yards away, walking toward the tannery. He stopped when he saw her. She stood in the middle of the lane in the morning light, with the cold on her face and the sounds of Heron Falls around her, and she did not take a step backward. She looked at him across the 10 yards of frozen ground, and she let herself be seen. Not the way she had been seen for 3 years, as something that had gotten away from where it belonged, but the way she was now. Standing upright in a town that had watched her come out of a gap in a wall and remain, one day at a time, in the light. She did not speak. She did not need to speak. Gorm stood at the end of the lane and looked at her in the open, in front of Hetta and Wren and Cade and Rook in the morning that had gone quiet around the moment. He saw what she had become here. Not what she had been, not the shape of the absence he had been tracking. The actual person standing in the lane, not because she was unafraid, but because she had chosen to be here more than she had chosen to be safe. And the difference between those two things was visible in the way she stood. He was looking for the girl who ran. The girl who ran was not in the lane. He stood there for a long moment in the cold, in the quiet of a town that was watching, and then something happened in his face that she had never seen happen there before. Not defeat exactly. Something more final than defeat. The end of a belief that had lasted longer than the evidence had ever supported. The belief that the things he called his were his because he called them that. He turned. He walked back down the lane. He did not look back. She stood in the middle of the lane and watched him go until he had turned the corner and the sound of his footsteps had been absorbed into the distance. Behind her, she heard Aldrich come to the doorway of the tannery. She did not turn around. She stood for a moment longer in the lane, in the light, and let the moment be what it was. Not the end of something and not the beginning, but the place where the thing that had needed to happen finally happened, and the day kept going on its own terms. Then she turned and went back inside. Aldrich had a cup of water on the table, near her place. Not in her hand. She picked it up and drank. Her hands were steady. The days after were ordinary, and ordinary had become, without her having tracked the exact moment of the change, something she had not had before. She fixed the stretching frame lacing on the second day after Gorm left. The left side had been uneven for more than a week. She had noticed it and said nothing, filed it in the category of things that were not her place to address. Then one morning her hands just fixed it. They did it without consulting her, the way hands did things when the work had become sufficiently familiar to move ahead of the permission. Aldrich noticed and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing to say. Wren came on a Thursday in early autumn. The hand is better, Wren said. Not fully. Better. The rib has healed, Wren said. The ear? Less, Vesna said. Wren nodded. She began the work on the right hand with the focused care she brought to every Thursday. And Vesna let herself be worked on with the same quality of presence. Not resigned, not enduring, but attending. Accepting the help the way Hedda had once suggested bread should be accepted, without apology and without the burden of feeling that you had incurred something by taking it. You look different, Wren said. Different how? Vesna said. More present. Like you're deciding to be in the room you're in instead of being in it and two other rooms at once. Vesna considered this. I still count the steps, she said. I know. Wren tied a knot. Do you still need to? Yes. Wren looked up. Then less than before? Vesna thought about it carefully. The number is the same, she said. The needing is different, Wren nodded. She understood the distinction without requiring it to be expanded. She packed her kit and paused at the door. That's what healing looks like, she said. Not forgetting, keeping, and not being kept by. She left the way she always left, without additional instruction, without the weight of her own opinion about what Vesna should do next. Hedda came on a Tuesday with more eggs than usual, and the bread she had been making since before Vesna arrived, and the energy of someone who had been carrying a question and had decided today was the day to set it down. You've been here almost 6 months, Hedda said. Vesna said, yes. Do you know what that means? That 6 months have passed. Hedda gave her the look she gave people who were being deliberately narrow. It means you have stayed somewhere. Do you know how many people manage that? People who have had to count exits every time they enter a room? Vesna looked at the doorway. 3 steps. Same as always. I still count, she said. I know, Hedda said. But you're not watching the count the way you watch something you're going to need immediately. You're keeping it the way you keep anything useful that you've learned, because it's yours and you decided to keep it. Vesna sat with this. She is right, she said eventually. She usually is, Hedda said. Don't tell her. She's insufferable enough about the Thursday visits. They sat for a while in the workshop with the autumn light coming through the open back window and the smell of the work around them and the ordinary sounds of Heron Falls moving through its late afternoon. On a morning in midsummer, Aldrich had asked, while they were both at the table with the work paused for water, whether she had thought about what came next. After what, she had said. After here, he said, not pressing, just asking. The way he asked things, as if the answer was something she had the right to know herself, and he was only providing the occasion for it. She had thought about it more than she had admitted. I used to think after was just the next place to run to, she said. She looked at the leather in her hands. Now I think after might just be more of now. Is now enough? She had looked up at him. The still face, the dye stain on the left forearm, the workshop that had been his alone for 6 years and was now occupied in the way spaces were occupied when someone had decided to remain in them. Is it for you? She asked. He looked at the table, at the tools, at the window with the afternoon light coming through it differently than it had before, because a room was different when someone had chosen to stay in it. Yes, he said. She went back to the work. On an evening in late summer, she had let him hand her the awl across the table without moving back. It was a small tool. She had needed it for the piece she was working on, and it was on his side of the table, and her hands were occupied, and he picked it up and held it out, and she took it. Their hands did not touch, but the reaching and the giving and the receiving happened in a space that was smaller than the spaces she had been maintaining, and she noted it afterward the way she noted things that needed accurate examination. She held the fact up and looked at what it was made of. It was not certainty. It was not the absence of fear. It was the presence of something that existed alongside the fear, something quieter and newer and less sure of itself. The way new things always were, the way a scar was when it first closed, fragile and real, and evidence that the body knew how to make something whole out of something that had been broken. She went on working. The autumn piece was finished on a Thursday morning in September. She set the strap leather on the table. It was a length of bridle leather, flat, the width of 2 fingers, taken from a remnant she had been given weeks ago and had looked at for several days before understanding what she was going to do with it. She had pressed a pattern into it, the repeating line. Her grandmother's pattern, the same one that had been in the blankets, in the tablecloths, in the fringe of every piece her grandmother's hands had made for 40 years. She turned it over and looked at the back. The impressions were clean. The leather had accepted the pattern the way leather accepted good work, without resistance, because good work did not force. She left it on the table and went about the morning's other work. Aldrich came in from the drying rack with a bundle of finished pieces. He set them on the long table. He looked at the strap leather. He picked it up. He turned it in his hands with the attention he brought to finish things, not looking for what he expected to find, looking for what was actually there. He looked at the pattern. He said, "Your grandmother." Not a question, a recognition. Vesna said, "Yes." He turned the strap over. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It's in the other pieces too. The harness edging, the burnishing work on the saddle skirt. I noticed it a few weeks ago." Vesna looked at the pieces on the wall. She had not seen it from the outside. She had only done it with her hands and not stood back to look. "I didn't know I was doing it," she said. He set the strap down carefully, the way he set down things that deserved to be set down carefully. "Do you want to tell me about her?" he said. "Not tell me about your grandmother," with the fixed shape of a question that already knew what kind of answer it wanted. Just the open one with room inside it. Vesna looked at the strap on the table. She looked at the repeating line pressed into the leather. She thought about her grandmother's hands and the loom and the 40 years of the same pattern and the patience of someone who had understood that you could not force the thing to be what it was not yet ready to be. You followed what was already there, and when it arrived, you made it mean something. She said she was a weaver. She worked alone. People left her alone because she smelled like the dye. I used to think that was the reason she worked alone. She paused. I think now she just preferred it. Aldrich said, "Both things can be true." "Yes," she said, "I know that now." She sat down on the stool near the wall, and then she kept going. She talked about her grandmother the way she had not talked about her since before the 3 years. Not in the edited version, not the version she would have given to someone who might use the information against her, but the full one. The one that had the smell of the dye and the sound of the loom in it, and the specific texture of a tablecloth she had been given as a child and had kept until keeping it was no longer possible. She talked about the pattern and why her grandmother had chosen it, which was a story she had been told once and had held in her memory with the careful attention you gave to things that might not be replaceable. She talked about the last time she had seen her grandmother work and what her hands had looked like, and the particular quality of the light in that room on that day, which she had not thought about in years and was surprised to find still intact inside her. Aldrich listened. He did not offer the things people offered when they were listening, but also waiting for their turn. He just listened, the way he worked, without forcing, without hurrying the material toward a conclusion it hadn't reached yet. When she finished, they sat for a while in the workshop's quiet. She was not sure how long. Long enough for the light to shift toward evening, long enough for the workshop to settle around them the way it settled at the end of a long working day, full and warm and honest about what it held. Outside, the evening was coming in gently. She could see it through the open back window, the particular softening of October light on the lane, the shadows growing longer and more deliberate, the way the town got quieter at this hour as people moved inward toward their own warmth. She looked at the window. She thought about the gap between that wall and the old stone fence. Just a space between two walls now, which was what it had always been before she made it into something else. She stood up. She went to the stove and banked the coals the way Aldrich had shown her, tamping them down to hold through the night. She set the grate. She straightened up. She had walked from the stool to the stove and back without counting. She stood in the middle of the workshop and let this register. She waited for the wrongness of it, the exposed feeling of a body that had moved through space without first measuring the space. The feeling she had learned to associate with carelessness, with the kind of lapse that could cost you everything. She did not feel it. She felt the warmth of the banked stove at her back and the smell of the work around her and the ordinary quiet of a building at the end of a day. She turned and counted. 3 steps to the front door, same as always. The number was there, accurate, unchanged, exactly where she had left it. She stood in the middle of the workshop in the early dark and held this. She had walked through the room without counting. The count was still there when she went looking for it. Both things were true at the same time. She had moved through the space, and the space had not become less safe for her having moved through it freely, and the count had not disappeared for her having not needed it in that moment. She was going to keep the 3 steps. Not because she needed them tonight, because they were hers. She had learned them at cost, the way all real things were learned, and the cost made them worth keeping even when the needing changed. She was still standing in the middle of the room when Aldrich came in from the back with a lamp. He saw her standing in the middle of the workshop in the dark. He stopped. He did not ask what she was doing. He looked at her face the way he looked at things that required accuracy, and then he went to the table and set the lamp down and adjusted the wick until the light settled warmly around the room. He did not comment on what he had walked into. He picked up a piece of work from the table and looked it over briefly and set it down and went to the back window to latch it against the night. She went to the pallet. She lay down. She pulled the blanket over herself. She did not count before she closed her eyes. She knew where the door was. She knew the number. She knew she could have it in the time it took to breathe, ready and complete if she needed it. Tonight she did not need it. She closed her eyes and let the building sounds come to her. The creak and settle of old wood, the bank stove's quiet breath, the distant mill that ran even after dark when the wind was right. And she let them be just sounds. The sounds of a place she was in. A place she had chosen, one day at a time, which was also the only way anything real was ever built. Outside, Heron Falls made its evening sounds and went to sleep. Inside the tannery at the end of the back lane, the lamp burned low and then lower, and the 2 people in the building breathed in the ordinary rhythm of people who had come to the same place from different directions and found, without having planned to find it, that the place was large enough for both of them and had been all along. The strap leather with the grandmother's pattern lay on the table in the lamplight. The 3 steps were there, ready and known. They were not needed tonight. And the knowing of that, the simple, unguarded, surprising fact of not needing them tonight, was the realest thing in the room.